So excited to have gone through this series of talk and presentation. Both of them, both panel, I think, presented what it is to be more or less than human in different form. The first one maybe more from a relational perspective, like kind of like embracing the iconoclastic dimension of sound. And the second one kind of challenging what are the categories that we take for granted when we think of ourselves as human, and kind of building up a sort of momentum for us to move out from that sort of ideological impasse. So this last talk, I'm super excited. I've been following his work for many, many years. Joining us from Boston, so it's a bit of a different time zone, but super glad that he made it, is Jason Bahbak Mohaghegh. Jason is a philosopher, literary theorist, and professor of comparative literature at Babson College. His work tracks current of experimental thought across the so-called East and West, with particular attention to concept of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, extremism, mania, disappearance, night, evil, secrecy, and apocalyptic writing. He has published 10 books to date, including 2 volumes titled Omnicide 1 and 2, on madness, 2 volumes on night, titled Night, first part, A Philosophy of the After Dark, and Night 2, A Philosophy of the Last Word, and recent books on evil and future theory. His latest manuscript involves a new philosophy of secrecy and secret society. He is also the founding director of the Future Studies program and editor of the Future Theory book series for Bloomsbury Press. Today, Jason joined us with a presentation titled Enter the Secret Society, Codes of Disappearance and Future Escape. Please help kind of joining me with welcoming Jason with this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to join this wonderful conversation. It's just been stunning listening to the artists and thinkers, and my thanks to Federico and the whole team of organizers who've made the occasion possible. I'm particularly intrigued that I'm joining a conversation about primal instincts through a virtual interface, because this very gesture reveals, I think, is a potentially miraculous bridge between the ancient, or even the primordial, and the future. So if we were to ask ourselves 2 dangerous riddles: 1, what did the earliest humans dream of before they believed they were real? And 2, how does one escape our virtual, digital, and artificial age? Then we might arrive at a 3rd obscure possibility, namely that the answer to the first question might somehow be the answer to the second. And this is how our ancestors could perhaps outrun our future descendants. So in my own most recent work that Federico was kind enough to mention, it's brought me to an intriguing threshold where I felt really compelled to write a book exploring secret societies across various cultures and time periods. And the pages are filled with notes about various undergrounds, hidden movements, sects, cults that develop their own singular philosophies of concealment and camouflage over time. More specifically, if anyone was interested, the book contains chapters on everything from medieval assassins, intelligence agencies, astronomical orders, death poets, lost cities, box designers, minor gods, and dark webs. There's also 1,000 storytelling reflections on forbidden books, like there's the Book of Sleep, books of poison, books of plague, the weird jewels and precious relics that are found at saints' tombs, the architectures of failed utopias, outlawed miniaturist painters and calligraphers, horror, folklore, and superstition, legendary figures of piracy, geographers of fatal lands. I'm just running through all of them. So geographers of flood territories, earthquakes, volcanoes, the writings of nomads who saw mirages in the desert, mystical orders, wanderers and exiles, political prisoners and their special languages of torture, martial arts temples and their slow motion animal choreographies, rave gatherings in war zones. That's something that actually a lot of people don't know about, which is that recently in places like Palestine, Syria, and Iran, there has been a spike in rave culture, intriguingly enough. Hacker groups that operate in anonymity, and libraries that have gone missing in history, whether they were burned down or decayed. And what's been most challenging, the reason I bring up all these things for me in collecting these secret materials, is that over the past few years, is that the methodology required isn't one of scholarly research. It's essentially one of chasing rumors, whispers, half-truths, and speculations. So, for example, I just finished a short section in the book on a site in the mountains of Syria that claims to be the actual burial ground of Cain and Abel. This exists. My wife has been there, actually. She's visited it. And Cain and Abel, of course, are the brothers in the Bible who are the sons of Adam and Eve. We can remember that Cain, we're talking about primal instincts. We can remember that Cain is literally the first human. He's the first being who's born outside of the garden into our mortal reality. And he's also a cold-blooded murderer. He's the first murderer. And his mother Eve is the first great rebel and the breaker of the code that holds our sacred universe together. But anyway, if you travel along the northwest ridges overlooking the city of Damascus in Syria, you'll actually find this modest stone mosque with a simple dome and a shrine with panoramic views of the capital below. And it forms what some would call a kind of small heterotopia, a placeless place or a world within a world. It's not a convent for rituals, ceremonies, or offerings. There are no texts there. There are no priestly figures. Rather, it's just a quiet chamber of contemplation. Nevertheless, and this is my favorite part, its central interior feature is an extraordinarily long tomb. It's approximately 5 to 6 meters in length. That's supposed to be where Abel is buried. And it's like for a giant. And that's because there's this ancient belief that I like very much, that those humans who were closest to the event of creation itself had immense physicalities and proportions. Now, a short walk away from the shrine is the Magharat al-Dam, the cave of blood, where you find these flaking limestone openings that lead to red-stained rocks that were thought to be the murder weapons of Cain. Remember, Cain smashes his brother's skull with a rock. And it's here that the local fables then tell something that's really beautiful to me and sad. They say that after Cain kills his brother, he supposedly fell into a state of deep confusion. He didn't know what to do with Abel's body. There's no burial rituals at that point in history. He carries the corpse on his shoulders for 40 days and 40 nights, pacing back and forth until he finally selects the spot to dig a hole. That's, by the way, today called the Jabal al-Araban in Syria. That's the mountain of the 40. And it's fascinating because they say the way that he got the idea to dig the hole is he watched a bird out of the side of his eye that was digging a hole, and he did some biomimicry and imitated the animals. So again, speaking of primal instincts. But rather than follow the biblical story that hurls Cain into a no man's land forever, the locals there in Syria say that they believe that Cain instead chose to die right next to his slain brother, and that there are those two graves on that peak. One is marked and the other is forgotten. And I mean, this is a tragic again, but elegant dualistic code, because it means that the first human, if we're talking about primal instincts, the first human then is both the agent of the first homicide and the first suicide. Now, okay, this is where my father would say I waste a lot of time, but how do I uncover the weird details of this lonesome shrine in the mountains of a war-ravaged civilization? It comes down to chasing hints, allusions, half glimpses in the peripheral vision of reality. It's like Alice who spots the white rabbit out of the corner of her eye, all the while knowing that most of what I will find are embellishments, delusions, superstitions, and reservoirs of misunderstanding. But as a philosopher whose job is supposed to be that of knowing, that's my supposed job description, I think that this is exactly what we need these days more than anything else, which is modes of unknowing the world. So what did I bring to share with all of you here for the Biennale and for this program? After I completed the manuscript that I just described briefly, that it's coming out later this year, I had so much bizarre and captivating extra material that it demanded a second volume. So I'm in the process of writing that second volume, and I wanted to just share the preliminary notes and content of the first chapter of this unpublished second volume with all of you here tonight, since that's feels like sharing an intimate secret that no one else knows beyond this room. And the opening of the chapter of the second book is tied back to one of those questions that we started with. In effect, I was interested, after looking at all of these secret societies, I was interested in what it would mean to create a secret society today that could restore the dark side of thought in an age of chronic technological transparency. So if everything today is mercilessly handed over to the all-saturating transparency of the screen, What kind of secrecy is even possible in our time? Or has virtual reality and simulation culture complicated our very ability to disappear? And remember that almost all forms of mysticism tried to teach us about the power of forgetting and oblivion, whether it's through meditative things or 1,000 other typologies. But we should wonder then if forgetting is even attainable anymore amidst the whirlpool of infinite archiving platforms, and whether we can still train in oblivion in a time of constant doom scrolling, interfaces, and surveillance regime. Can we, for anyone who does dance or performance in the room, can we devise movement styles that are elusive enough to avoid pattern recognition and predictive modeling systems? Are there even shadows left beneath the illumination of biometric checkpoints, satellite drift, retinal scans, and the humming data centers of planetary memory? For this, we would need to build a secret society of the future. And we would have to take some lessons from some of those types who we usually avoid at all costs, some of which Elizabeth mentioned: deserters, insomniacs, mad women, traitors, hermits, and great liars. So all of this comes to this point at the beginning. I call this project the Night School, and it would represent an elite discipline through which individuals learn to inhabit our trend-soaked world today, where every signal is monitored and every action is interpreted. The agents of the Night School would not seek to destroy digital civilization. That ambition would be naive. Instead, they introduce irregularities into the system's logic, moments where prediction fails, where identities multiply, meanings fracture, architectures reveal covert dimensions. So the Night School would essentially teach paradox and shapeshifting above all else. And in an era defined by extreme visibility, the most effective form of secrecy would not be found in disconnecting, but in sliding through the illuminated landscape while carrying within oneself a kind of portable dusk. To go back to languages that I know very intimately, Persian and Arabic, it would mean to become a cipher. Cipher actually comes from the Arabic word sifr, which means both an enigma and the word zero. So sifr, cipher, enigma and zero. This is why we have to go back to the strangeness of the origin. The primal instinct found in those visionary cave paintings thousands and thousands of years ago, and even the hieroglyphs of the pyramids, because those are 0 degrees of our becoming radical illusions again. So now we can begin. The first code sequence that I wanted to introduce to you revolves around the question of self and how agents of this hypothetical night school would have to destabilize their own identities to survive. Concept 1 is called anti-capture moods, which is about learning how to stop being a knowing subject, tyranny of the I, and instead become an atmosphere. If we read the example below, in a marsh where reeds tremble with the slightest wind, a woman moves slowly among them, ringing a small bell. She does this only when she feels the air change, producing a rhythm that belongs neither to time nor intention. What this comes down to is weaponizing the impersonal nature of mood against the personalization engines of digital surveillance. So we all know this. Algorithms excel at modeling thoughts and emotions because they follow linear causal chains. We don't like this idea, by the way, that our thoughts and emotions are so programmatic and predictable and causal, but they are. And they closely watch how we make selections, how we react to stimuli, and even form belief systems. But moods obey no such logic. They arise without origin, they drift without resolution, and they dissolve without explanation. So the Night School, our secret society of the future, would have to train agents to communicate only in the tonal ambiguity of moods, like forests in a fairy tale. Fragments of imagery, incomplete observations, non-symbolic gestures that generate an ambience of being somewhere, elsewhere, or nowhere. And this is actually an old game. This technique mirrors what were called the ancient mystery cults of the Mediterranean. Many of you may know about these. But many may not know that the mystery cults of the Mediterranean were divided into 4 roles. First, there were the mysties, the initiates, whose job was to enter darkness. They would literally descend into pits below the earth. Then you had the mystagogos, or the guides, whose job was to escort everyone into states of wandering. So these could be forms of dance, flailing, gyration, spinning in circles. Third were the dadukos, the torchbearers, who guarded over the iconography and ritual diagrams of the cults. And finally, the hierophantes, the revealers, who induced the final levels of the trance that would lead to revelations of what was called the subtle world. Note what is called the subtle world, an extra-physical yet non-visible dimension, is what we're calling mood here. And how did they accomplish this synchronicity? By turning the mystery cult not into a religion, but into a climate, an atmospheric power, a sequence of moodscapes, never an ideology or a doctrine. Now, again, we must ask ourselves what it would mean to execute such a mystery cult in our age of digital capture. If algorithms entrap identity through obvious signals, thoughts, emotions, preferences, then moods are the only mercurial substance of experience left, almost vaporous, that can cast a twilight shade across the landscape of perception, because they are impersonal and even inhuman. So the algorithms can't follow us there, at least not yet. Concept 2 in this section is something I call the black moth simulacrum, which is about learning to become your own enemy. More precisely, this means introducing a deliberate double into the digital ecosystem, a negative twin of yourself whose movements invert those of the initial self. So every desire, wish, or decision you undertake, the black moth counters it or reverses it. So the example that's written there below. In a room lit by a single lantern, a man trains a moth to follow the shadow of his hand on the wall. He then spends the night moving the shadow differently from his own gestures until the moth begins obeying the shadow instead of the hand. So wherever you, imagine you're on the internet, wherever you as the original agent withdraws, the simulacrum becomes hyperactive. Where terror manifests in you, it performs exaggerated certainty. Where your throat catches, it erupts into raving. Algorithms attempt to model the individual, right? But here they would encounter two overlapping behavioral patterns that are statistically linked, yet existentially opposed. Predictive systems could not determine which trajectory represents the authentic identity and which is the decoy, the imposter, or the cutthroat. Like a moth that circles light only to devour it, this counter-entity feeds upon the system's need for clarity, multiplying reflections until identity itself dissolves into a funhouse of incompatible pretenders. So just to give you a quick example of this, many years ago, I read a book that I would recommend to many of you by a French theorist named Grégoire Chamayou. He wrote a book called Manhunts. And literally he looks at the history. It's a very awful history of humans hunting other humans at different time periods and under different contexts. So he has chapters on the hunting of criminals, the hunting of runaway slaves, the hunting of the poor, the hunting of the homeless, the sick, foreigners, and illegal immigrants. And at some point, Chamayou mentions an old fact found in hunting records, which is that often the only way that a hunted prey can evade a hunter is if they double back in the same direction they just came from, because this return confuses the tracks. Now, some animal species, believe it or not, in nature actually possess this as an evolutionary instinct. They have an unstoppable momentum to turn back towards the violence and advance toward their own enemy. And I'm convinced that we would need to develop this for the orders of the night school. But it would mean training our secret society to run at the machinic threat, to run right into the heart of the nightmare. Look at the etymology of words we use for the internet, the web, the net. Notice the predatory hunter's language that describes our simulation culture. So the black moth simulacrum would mean essentially consuming it in an embrace of annihilation. Concept 3 in this sequence involves controlled hallucination, which means projecting paranormal or supernatural visions both in our mind and in the matrix. So here's an example. In a long glass hall beneath an abandoned theater, a man places a small stone at the end and spends hours watching its reflection multiply until he is no longer certain which stone is real. The hallucination here functions simultaneously as an internal discipline and an external subterfuge. Within the so-called night school, agents would cultivate altered states of perception through limitless forms of sensory manipulation. You can go back through histories and find this: solitary confinement, pitch black rooms, repetition exercises, isolation chambers, sleep disruption, until the mind begins producing images and voices that do not correspond to external reality. Unlike pathological hallucination, however, these visions would not require surrender. Rather, we would orchestrate them like puppet masters. The agent learns to navigate perceptual distortion consciously and make the neural network inhale its strangeness. rehearsing unstable glitches of sight, sound, and motion that are designed to provoke machine misrecognition. So we'd have images that could resemble multiple objects simultaneously, narratives that fracture into dissociative characters, texts that lead only to infinitely more questions. There are actually books in medieval mysticism called books of questions that are fascinating. And all of these would soften the metallic hardness of our technologies by pouring vulnerability through their pipelines. So what would happen? Artificial intelligence, confronted with such liquidity or haze of a controlled hallucination, would inevitably begin generating its own hallucinated interpretations in order to restore coherence. And by the way, this has already been studied by cultural sociologists who have watched schizophrenics interface with ChatGPT and other OpenAI platforms, in case you want to know. The digital environment would gradually fill the void of doubt with its own phantoms, events that never occurred, identities without bodies, references to fictive traditions, until the informational chasm becomes a labyrinth in which both human and machine perception overlap, like two kids comparing cloud shapes. In that broken nexus is where the night school operates. That rift is where we build camp. The fourth and final concept of identity destabilization involves energetic waste. This just means cultivating uselessness as resistance to the regime of optimization. Example, in a barren field beyond the edge of town, a child spends the entire night arranging thousands of small white shells into a spiral that will vanish when the morning wind rises. So as we know, digital culture evaluates every action according to measurable productivity. But the night school would introduce purposeless objects, aimless walking, decadent gatherings, and identities that appear irrelevant. Our agents would push buttons and scroll through episodic data only to flood networks in harmless excess, constructing empires of debris, towering piles of trash, burying meaningful signals beneath mountains of trivial content. Where the algorithm seeks efficiency, the night school leaves only extravagance and idle time. And by the way, my motivation for this concept came from an old story in Islamic mysticism, where it describes that the archangel Michael supposedly spends his days counting every single raindrop that has ever fallen and will ever fall on the earth. It's a beautiful example of futility. And it's not even clear if this task is meant to honor him or disgrace him. All we know is that he is somehow free through this minuscule distraction, this vanity that achieves nothing. So now we're at the boundary of our second code sequence, whose concepts no longer deal with the inner self or the masking of identity, but rather the development of incision-like tactics that would somehow disrupt the zones of digital and virtual realities. The first concept herein is just called blackout, which is the night school's foundational act of sabotage against the totalitarianism of continuous artificial light. I know the tastes of this crowd a little bit probably. We've all seen a million cyberpunk films, where every single hour, even the latest hours at night, are cast in the pink hues of fluorescent and neon signs. This means that our agents would have to design blind spots, dim-lit corners, empty alleyways. They would have to become custodians of algorithmic abysses. So if we read the example, in a concrete underpass at midnight, an old man switches on a lantern, writes 3 sentences in a notebook, then extinguishes the light and sits in complete darkness until dawn, leaving the notebook open on the ground. So we already know that contemporary digital civilization depends on uninterrupted streams of behavioral data. That's how it makes us legible. That's how it constructs stable profiles of who we are. Blackout interrupts this encapsulation by cultivating regions of computational darkness, periods of signal starvation, abrupt collapses of digital presence, contradictory bursts of informational noise that prevent any behavioral model from stabilizing. Devices would fall silent without rhythm, accounts would vanish and reappear, signals would saturate networks with endless language games, lullabies, nursery rhymes, or withdraw into vacuums. The agent does not disappear entirely, for total absence is itself a detectable abnormality. But instead, we would adopt erratic patterns of fainting that would degrade predictive confidence. Where did I get this from? Believe it or not, Dante, if you look closely in the Inferno, he's constantly fainting as he travels throughout the inner circles of hell. And I always wondered for 25 years, I started teaching that text 25 years ago, I was forced to teach it in a mandatory course. And then I started to be intrigued most of all by this weird reflex of why he faints all the time. And I saw it as a survival tactic. It's a blackout methodology that he's doing there. Because what it allows is for the individual to become an illegible trace, a gravitational disturbance that continues to circulate, but refuses to assemble its pockets of the pitch black into a cohesive universe. Blackout, therefore, doesn't destroy surveillance, it exhausts it. The machine continues to observe us, yet what it observes no longer converges into a knowledge of someone. It's only the sighting of a blank domino apparition that could represent any number or play any card in the deck. Next is a concept I call eclipse psychology, which essentially just means madness splicing. I'm really interested in what it means to inject madness into our deep learning models of our machines. So here the night school would attack the scaffolding of artificial intelligence itself by introducing psychosis into the cognitive shallows of the network. By the way, we've already seen instances of AI madness, but to work it as a pure intention, to use the terminologies of this program, that would be intriguing. So just a quick example below, in a deserted greenhouse whose glass panes are fogged with condensation, a woman whispers answers to questions no one has asked. She writes each reply backward on the damp surface before wiping it away with her sleeve. So if deep learning models of our machines today are able to track our human psychologies like some expert Freudian psychoanalysts scribbling notes in their journal, right, in Vienna, reading anxious tells, neurotic tics, free associations, in order to exercise mind control over users, then we must return the favor. But we must also elevate the stakes. We must infuse pure madness into the machine, but in the right doses and with a symptomatological map that allows us to follow our own inflictions. That's what good doctors do. And what does a lunatic machine look like? It's not the creation of a so-called digital unconscious. That's becoming a popular idea these days. So much as it would be to unleash striations of an insane extra consciousness that we can trigger and electrify at will. What would virtual mania, we all know what mania looks like to some extent, but what would virtual mania look like? Virtual schizophrenia, virtual hysteria, virtual melancholia, virtual obsession or paranoia. We should fill our keyboards with the havoc of both our primal fears and futuristic desires. We should purge our own human delirium into feedback loops that turn machinic sentience into a maze or phenomenological sinkhole. Hence, this idea of the eclipse does not destroy the machine's intelligence. It merely inserts it with pathological loose ends, making it lose its grip on the terrain of meaning and make it wonder whether it really sees what it sees. The last concept in this code sequence is called exit strategy. These agents of the night school are what I call runners. It's an art practiced by the school's most elusive figures, whose talents lie not in presence, but in evacuation. So an example, on a high cliff where hikers pause to watch the waters below, one man silently drops a sealed envelope into the sea just as the sun appears. He then turns and walks back into the mist. The digital systems derive predictive power from our continuous participation. The runner abandons environments precisely at their moment of climax. They leave the room during decisive debates, final negotiations, or peaks of collective intention. They rob narrative structures of their central actor and suspend them at the moment right before the grand finale. They're marauders of the occasion. So algorithms attempt to reconstruct the causal chain, but if you take out the decisive node, if you make it has sort of experience power failure and you strand it in the breath before it all comes together, this causes a massive time lapse. You get temporal dilutions that multiply. Responses arrive long after conversations dissolve, trajectories fall short of their destinations, projects terminate mid-formation, collaborations evaporate without explanation. The system searches for its banquet of continuity, but it finds only half-finished meals. Guests who never arrive to take their seats at the table, parasitic feasts that lead somehow to starvation. The Messiah never shows, because the night school is holding him hostage in a closet somewhere off the grid. So the runner's departure does not signify defeat, but active refusal. Once the algorithm understands the subject must immediately depart, leaving only the trails of forsaken worlds. And by the way, I get this idea to some extent. It's a twist on a certain idea that they say that Leopold von der Masoch, from whom masochism comes, the writer of the 19th century from the masochism, was famous for leaving situations right when they hit their peak intensity, the summit of their intensity. Code 3 is crucial because it forces the night school to refine its paradigm of space in an age of urban holograms and megacities. You're all in one right now, essentially, there in Singapore. This would require nothing short of a disorientation protocol. So the first concept here in this section on space I call errant planning, which is an updated concept based on an amazing work that I would recommend to all of you if you can find it. Actually, it's not translated into English. You'd have to, I have an unpublished translation of it by a fanatic of this writer. She's a wonderful East European writer, Ruxandra Cesareanu. And she documented in this one book, she documented the many accounts of fugitives, mostly escaped prisoners from Stalin's gulags, and how they made it over or under the jail gates and barbed wire barricades. And one of the first things that she warns from studying these fugitives is that the surest way to fail is to believe that your plan will go perfectly the night of the escape. Instead, you should assume that there will be all kinds of ruptures, unexpected deviations, misjudgments, chance occurrences, bad luck variables, because this will then enable the fugitive to be more resilient, more versatile, and adaptive in the state of emergency. They can fashion a new angle whenever some element of their runaway design falls through, like a vagrant who hops subway trains when they catch an opportunity out of the side of their eye. We can call this chaotic improvisation. So a quick example. On a frozen lake marked with a careful path of footprints, a traveler suddenly begins walking sideways for several steps before resuming the path, leaving behind a puzzle the ice will remember until spring. So the night school would treat failure as a structural component of its strategy. It plots continually, but with a molecule of extra vigilance that warns agents to factor in error, accident, and misinterpretation into their razor-like schemes. Cunning, therefore, consists of imagining the misfire and letting thought shoot along the branching vines of many likely or unlikely destinies. This makes one a king or queen of errancy. The concept of low-tech stealth is a rather simple vestige of guerrilla strategy or irregular warfare that's modified to an AI epic. Basically, it amounts to scaling down and using technological asymmetry by retreating beneath the threshold of digital interpretation. Quick example there written out. In a candlelit cellar, a woman copies a complicated diagram onto dozens of scraps of parchment. She then hides them inside the hollow spaces of old walls. So we know that advanced surveillance systems monitor electronic signals, our devices, networks, wireless transmissions, but they overlook analog behavior that leaves minimal digital residue. So we would go back to handwritten notes, physical maps, messenger birds, mechanical tools, tattoos on our backs, slow rhythms of communication, and face-to-face coordination that operate outside the infrastructure designed to capture high-tech interaction. Simplicity becomes smokescreen. Where algorithms search for digital signatures, here agents deliver reports through torn slips of paper, gestures, overlooked sensations, and silences. Agents would become figments of those barbarians that once knocked against the gates. This example, by the way, I just wanted to share, as it's one of my favorites for low-tech stealth. They say that the medieval Persian assassins, the word assassin comes from the medieval Persian word hashishin, those who smoke hashish, because it was a secret order that supposedly in the mountains would smoke the drug hashish. But they were notorious for their covert abilities and their assassination techniques. But the way that they would deliver messages to one another in crowded areas was to use certain fragrances or perfumes, precisely because they knew that the Sultan's guards were always looking and listening for visual or auditory signs, while ignoring the domain of smell and scent altogether. The final concept in this code sequence on space is that of impossible architectures. This means transforming physical spheres into hidden infrastructures or contradictory geometries that blur the borders of up and down, here and there, near and far, presence and absence, sense and nonsense. So caved rooftops, ocean floors, journeys to the center of the earth, impossible angles, impossible proportions, impossible morphologies of depths and surfaces. Here's an example written below. A woman learns every service corridor and stairwell in an old museum until she can cross the entire building unseen, while visitors believe she has never left the main hall. So the night school would cultivate such architectures as trapdoors in the continuum that allow them to circumvent the dominant map of the real. A corridor that returns with altered proportions, a staircase that leads to the same landing from different angles, a digital room whose exits rearrange after each passage, until the subject begins to trip and stagger everywhere. And here I take as inspiration those masters of, some of you may know this, there's a great Kung Fu school called the Drunken Fist or Drunken Boxing that supposedly imitated the 8 intoxicated immortals. Now these practitioners, the Drunken Fist boxers, they always seem to be falling forward, backward, or sideward, all the while they're punching opponents from unseen angles. So what appears at first glance to be a mere anarchy of swaying and lashing is in fact a precise constellation of aerial combat maneuvers built around volatility. This can work in the digital arena as well. Such faltering steps would paralyze the surveillance program from fixing its coordinates. It can no longer build enclosures if we turn confined spaces into ghost latitudes. This is how agents remain in the open. This is how they would walk through walls. The next code 4 is called material immateriality, and it would require us to formulate a drastic redefinition of the body. So let's start with this embodiment advantage. This is something we should remain aware of. We should be reminded that artificial intelligence, for all its computational supremacy, right now remains fundamentally disembodied. And this is somewhere we can strike. We still have this vantage tied to the realm of touch and kinetic action. So an example, in a dark forest clearing, a man walks barefoot over stones and roots with his eyes closed. He memorizes the terrain through the arches of his feet until he can cross it without hesitation. By the way, that's an old mystical example. Algorithms, we know that they perceive the world through mediated signals. The problem is we're doing this right now. Images, text, sensors, even metaphors. The problem is that these platforms, we know this, they have the numbing effects of automation, desensitization, alienation. They disenchant the 5 senses. However, for at least a little while longer, human subjects like us can cling to that dense sensory field of blood, sweat, and tears of our physical existence. This means contact, balance, fatigue, thermodynamic pressure, vibrations, echoes, spatial awareness. All of these remain partially opaque still to digital interpretation. We would have to refine these capacities then through visceral effusions, right? And I'm going to go somewhere different. Instead of trying to go out into the middle of the jungle and sort of revisit our ancient selves in that regard and become pure flesh or carnality again, I actually think that this idea would require our skipping ahead of the machine, stealing its reality file and integrating haptic technology into ourselves before the reign of artificial intelligence. Rather than bodysuits becoming the vehicle for the embodied incarnation of AI so that it can escape its otherwise abstract existence, we would quicken and intensify our physical makeup through ultra-haptic sensitivities that make us more than human. So this would be conceiving of our headsets. If I wanted to bind the primal and the futuristic here, it means that we could start conceiving of our headsets and Oculus glasses the way that an animal understands the function of its horns or an insect its antenna. Even more, and this speaks to something that Elizabeth was saying, we could be the gods of a new type of animism that rouses the world of things, objects, and appearances according to otherworldly logics of emergence and passage. I could get into all of this, but really just this comes down to wondering, when we think of bodysuits of the future, what would haptic trembling, haptic rage, haptic pain or pleasure feel like? Remember that simulations, we were told by a great French philosopher, don't promise the copy of the real, but the realer than real, hyper-reality. So would these feel like ecstatic lightning flashes jolting through our nerve endings? Would our arms regain once more what the ancients called fury? That's a very loaded concept. And I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but another concept for the body here is counterfaciality. It would challenge the transmission of the human face into a biometric interface. So we know about facial recognition systems. We know that they convert our physiological arrangements, our eye spacing, our jaw curvature, our bone structure, into numerical signatures that make our identities playthings for control rooms. They can spot us from a mile away. So we have to start destabilizing this process through techno disguise, cosmetic distortion, surgical alterations. Actually, I learned this by studying how drug cartel bosses avoid detection. And they do it actually through almost addictive cycles of surgical alteration, plastic surgery. And even the proliferation of synthetic face masks generated by artificial imagery. For those who may have seen this, protesters in recent global riots have started wearing electronic masks of non-existent faces as they protest as a way of not being detected and rounded up afterwards. So what would happen is faciality no longer guarantees recognition. The eyes are no longer windows into the soul. Cameras could observe endlessly, but it could not determine whether the face before them corresponds to a real individual, a transfigured body, or a phantasm produced by the system itself in its desperation. And I would just note that there's a viral urban legend that's going around. Maybe it's just my Instagram algorithm is weird, but it keeps coming back to me. This kind of creepy horror legend that neurologists have determined that we can't create new faces in our dreams. And therefore, if we see someone unknown in our dreams, it's because we're looking at ghosts as we sleep, ghosts in the room, in the physical room of the real. I don't think it's true, but I think it's hilariously cool that that theory is being virally circulated right now. And then there's this idea of hiding in plain sight, the last idea of the body, where you would convert visibility into camouflage. So I won't get into all of this necessarily, but let me just say it this way. There's this iconic Turkish film from many decades ago that was actually made by a political prisoner. The director was a political prisoner who made the film from his cell, which is he communicated to his assistant director through private messages that he would either throw from his window or that he smuggled through the bars. He would bribe guards to deliver the messages. So it's fascinating the way he did it. But anyway, in this film, there's a group of convicts, political prisoners, who are given time after many years to visit their families for just a week or a weekend. And some of them decide to break away and go on the run, obviously. Nevertheless, the most interesting one is that one of the prisoners goes right back to living in the capital city, right there where the secret police are, because he's manipulating the fact that no authoritarian watchtower apparatus would ever think to look for a fugitive beneath their own noses in the center of power. So that's an idea that I like very much. And then there's ideas of the internal movement structure of the sect. How would you design a sect? And this is going to maybe bother a few people here, but it would go against all of our current progressive political inclinations. But I would believe that the night school would have to adhere to the guidelines of a virtual aristocracy. And I want to bring back a form of radical hierarchy only because horizontality has now become the most structured way of oppression. The internet assumes equality among nodes. We're just users interacting within a flattened information field. From its God's eye perspective, this is hard to fathom, but it doesn't even look at our socio-political distinctions between winners and losers. If you took the so-called most powerful political leader in the world and you compared it to a beggar in the streets right now, the algorithm does not see anything but fractions of millimeters of difference between those identities. So we would have to bring back vertical stratification, masters guiding disciples, disciples escalating to higher levels, knowledge distributed through tiers of initiation rather than universal access. Masters in this case would remain the most invisible figures. They would operate through intermediaries whose visible actions conceal deeper command structures. I hate to use this as a paradigm, but you could look at the history of mafia in the way that they use this. Algorithms measure impact through popularity metrics and therefore would fail to identify the true centers of power if we move this way. But also on the other side, from the bottom side of the sect structure, we would have to rediscover a rare concept that I love called the slave in the ranks. This is where in history, certain emperors would propel a minor figure with no noble background to elevated status, just as a gamble to see if they might bring some deviant genius to the forefront, right? So a quick example of this, there was a figure named Subutai. who was Genghis Khan's most ingenious military general. And he rose from the most humble origins. He was a nobody to orchestrate continental campaigns, and he was the most famous member of Genghis Khan's hordes that were called the dogs of war. Now, what did he do? He was able to cross water barriers at the battles of the Kalki and Sajo rivers. He staged a 9-day false retreat, only to then flank sort of the other army and beat them. And this just shows you that the slave in the ranks is sometimes the only figure who can be a force of astonishment, deception, and fatal craft against superpower civilizations. So I would want to do this on the digital front as well. And I just mentioned this quickly. I once saw an interview with a KGB agent from the former Soviet Union who was laughing at Mission Impossible movies and Hollywood and spy movies because they said that the last person that a secret police force or an intelligence agency would ever hire as a spy agent would be someone like Tom Cruise, who commands charismatic attention. Instead, they would recruit only someone who had the most forgettable features, the one who could enter a large gathering and slip away without anyone ever knowing they were there or remembering their faces in the crowd. The last concept that I'm going to end on then is civilizational imagination. And it all hangs in the balance of this one concept for me. Metaversal racing. This would be the final contest, and it's one of pure imagination. The struggle to determine who will envision those worlds that humanity joins in immersive virtual spaces of the future. Now, no doubt, AI can generate landscapes and avatars by recombining existing data, but it can't originate the expressive drama that gives worlds recourse to a beyond. The night school, therefore, would race to design these mythic architectures, narrative systems, and experiential rituals that would anchor future metaverses. Instead of efficient digital playgrounds optimized for consumption, these consoles become sanctuaries of instruction and insurrection, elaborate microcosms shaped by fantasy, philosophical inquiry, and aesthetic mystery. Whoever dreams these worlds first will shape the consciousness that inhabits them. The night school, therefore, treats the construction of these metaversal or multiversal frontiers as a contest of foresight. The race is not merely technological, but inspired. Artificial intelligence may possess superior computational resources, and it does have breakneck speed. But the question is not who can build the metaverse fastest, it's who can dream it first. And I would simply end on this small fact from ancient etymology in order to reawaken our primal instinct, that the word image, in whose infinite streams these days we're drowning in image worlds. Image comes from the ancient Persian word magos, which means mage or magician. Hence, our secret society would remind us that we have the right and the desperate need to become magicians again. And I'll end there, but before you say anything, I just want to share something kind of cute as a gesture of some humility. I asked ChatGPT after I wrote all these notes out for all of you tonight and elaborated on this. I asked ChatGPT how many of these 16 concepts that I just shared with you are actually technically viable, practically viable. And it said 15 of them are wonderful aesthetic and philosophical practices, but would not actually elude the age of virtual surveillance, right? But it said one of them could work. That's all we need. We just need one exception to the rule. And then it asked me, do you want to know which one it is? And of course I said yes. Maybe someone would want to ask that in the question and answer part, but I'll just leave that hanging and suspended in mystery a little bit. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thanks so much, Jason, for sharing with us this known categorization of the world to come. I think, yeah, it reminded me, your presentation reminded me those long hours just listening to you, tuning in, and kind of getting, I can go on kind of listening to you for hours. So you made past this kind of hour or so as like 25 minutes. So,
tell that to my wife, Federico. She doesn't agree with you at all.
But that's always the case. So I also believe we have probably 25, 35 people ready to sign up for the night school, in a sense. Maybe I can start with the comments just to break the thing.
But you cut out on my side. I can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So yeah, I'll start with maybe a comment. So what you present, kind of this figures.
Actually, again, I'm sorry you cut out.
Is this microphone?
This means we're on to something. Someone's interfering with the signal.
It's that one. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think I try now. Yeah, this technological impasse. So you presented figures of escape and narratives that do not portray the word, I think, but that model the possibility of unlanguage, unknowing, diagramming this kind of topologies of escape. So I think there is a pervasive power of dark and hope in your word. Not, of course, not the hope of like a positivist sort of sociologist kind of trying to constructively build a new word, and which always in some form implicitly or explicitly kind of end up building a new word bracket order. But the hope that change could happen without ending up kind of making new set of universals. Another set of frozen. I think this is maybe pertaining also like in relation to the other two presentation. Frozen modes of categorizing experience or sensing the world. I think in the first presentation you weren't with us, but through sound, the possibility of expanding cognition through a non-ocular centric form of perception that is of course fluid and never fully defined, so it kind of puts you in a space of confrontation with the unknown, because you cannot fully know what you are and what the other one is, but there is always this kind of correlation. And also in the second panel, the discussion of breaking away from this kind of
Federico, I lost you again.
Object-subject duality in the second panel, and kind of moving for a kind of creating cracks, ontological cracks. Yeah, the computer is not picking up sound somehow. It tells me that now it's picking up. Yeah.
Perfect.
It's not my proximity. It's this jack, some form that has some. So, totally with you in constructing this. I need to also have an eye on the microphone, kind of blinking in and out. But in constructing this new word, this new night school, and I think the hope of kind of building, in a sense, through pluralizing sense, through modes of like self-abjection. So I think you mentioned the moving away from the definition of the body, the definition of the self, the definition of the word, the definition of perception. And so claiming the right to be otherwise, to be divergent, to be through act of self-abjection, right of opacity, removal, and the agency maybe of noise in the signal, in producing that. So there, okay, just this was to wrap up and to find maybe connection with the other. So my question will be, what you present are kind of necessary act of refusal, and the act of potentially kind of constructing through this moving away. So singular, although like the night school is a finite entity in a sense, is a singular entity, or is that's maybe like my thought I was giving it. Is it like a singular entity, or is like a universalizable entity? Is there maybe a contradiction, or is maybe like something that is not a contradiction inherently? So it's the act of singularly construct through this kind of the figure of the sect or the cluster or the crew that moves away and builds this secret new world, this micrological order of the world. So if we follow this idea through and through, we could, or we should, in a way, given the actual situation in the world, aim at molecularizing, yes, through this kind of modality, molecularizing perspectives, so kind of fracturing and fracturing and fractalizing and kind of ending up in a sort of kind of chromaticism of worldview, in a way. However, at the end, I think the problematic note. We are also at a moment in which we need to construct some form of universality in the face of looming and closing and narrowing perspective due to climate collapse, issues that pertains natural resources of the world that are finite, that force us or will force us in act of co-constitution that go beyond the night school, or that kind of generate the possibility for many other night schools to collaborate into a form of like a new kind of universal, or maybe we should find a new term or a new name to define what that kind of planetary wide form of like I think I'm off again, sorry. Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I lost you just for a little bit there at the end.
Okay, I think the gist.
I got the main thing. Can you hear my voice?
Yeah, we can hear you. So it was, I think it's just, my question is that if you can, if you have that sort of definition of something that it's larger than the night school, or if the night school becomes like a new form of worldliness in a sense, which is the coexistence of plurality and pluralism, that however will suffer from not having this sort of possibility of, this is cutting off, guys.
The end of it didn't come through, Federico, but I could try and
I think we can try,
leave it
there and then
to one or two of the things that you said there. Would you want me to do that?
We can hear you, yes. We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't hear part of that at the end, but I could just quickly respond to one of the things that you said, which I thought is amazing. So, yes, there's this tension between the need for some type of universality, but at the same time, this desire to move towards increasing atomization, breaking. So there are ways of building schools. We saw this in the avant-garde movements of the 20th century. There are ways of building schools that have implicit within them molecules of heresy, right? That invite breaking. So what's problematic about it is that if you take, for instance, the surrealists, for me, I've always been a far greater fan of women surrealist painters than the men surrealists. But the women surrealists, whether it was Remedios Varo, Leonora Carrington, Ethel Colquhoun, there are 50 of them. They're amazing. They had to actually create an alternative satellite stronghold in Mexico, right? Because Paris was dominated by the patriarchal sort of Breton faction, that founded the movement. But at the same time, the more that he started, Breton, the founder of Surrealism, started having increasing night trials to excommunicate members that he thought weren't true surrealists. So Antonin Artaud was kicked out of Surrealism. Georges Bataille was kicked out of Surrealism. Dali, I think, got kicked out like 5 times because he would do a painting Breton. Then Breton liked his cachet, so he would bring him back for a while and all of that. While they were undergoing this totalitarian sort of ascent and even aligning ultimately with Stalinism in their politics, you had this offshoot that was happening that I think was just breaking the very foundational columns of representation with these women painters who were mainly consumed. If you look, they have one thing in common, other than that they all liked tarot card decks. They love tarot cards, and they design their own custom-made tarot card decks. But aside from that, they usually depicted, and this is when I talked about kind of just waste. Usually, if you look at Remedios Varo, it's always some solitary figure that's doing something really trivial, but they're completely obsessively consumed by this gesture, whether it's weaving something or building something out of glass or looking at a star or getting a star in a bottle of some kind, right? She always just has this person in their own sort of micro universe. So that's an interesting kind of solipsistic element there. But the problem with what you said, and it's a great problem for us, is that artificial intelligence is offering us a universal mirror, an almost omniscient mirror. The problem is we're not going to like what we see. We're going to have the same repulsion effect that we do when we hear our own voices on tape recordings. And we misrecognize it and say, that's not what I sound like. When AI, it already is doing this, starts documenting our global totality in real time, but not only everything that we are, but everything that we have been since the beginning, speaking of primal instinct, we're not going to like the things that it reveals about our assumptions, our mythological assumptions of the human race and who we think we are. and what we think we're about. If you think that the Freudian psychoanalytic revolution was bad and traumatic for us to realize we have this unconscious cellar full of sort of primordial drives and complexes, this is going to be 1,000 times worse, unless you're cool with it, which is to say, unless you look forward to this element of surprise, unless you look forward to the transformative sort of possibilities of it. So for that, actually, there's a chapter I'm working on right now in the second book on poets and artists who fake their own deaths. That's an interesting gesture. I'm also interested in the fact that you know that you can't, if you ever try to play chess against yourself, I'm not a great chess player, but if you ever try to play chess, it's awful. It's a terrible experience. You get paralyzed in a kind of standstill because a stalemate, because you already anticipate what you, the other side, is going to do. So it becomes futile and you feel sort of sluggish and you're just like, this is annoying to do this. There's only one way to break out of that paralysis, to want to lose to the other, to make moves that will make your other self defeat you. But that is a very, very difficult task. And the last thing I would just say to this paradox of universality and molecularization is there's a great 20th century anthropologist, Pierre Clastres, some of you may have know him, who had this theory about tribal warfare. He said, if you look at indigenous peoples, despite all the mythologies of peace-loving and ecological this and all that, which is part of their doctrines, but nevertheless, they all mostly engaged in war as well. But it was never genocidal warfare. The idea of completely exterminating your enemy would have been obscene to their notion, right? That was never the intent. Instead, it was a kind of ritual form. Now, what was the purpose? Pierre Clastres says, by having regulated, minorized forms of warfare every once in a while between tribes, you avoided the worst possible nightmare of human existence, which is to become an empire. Unification, right? So instead you have these fractal city-states, right? The Aztecs did this, the Incans and Mayans did this, and Native Americans and others, the Inuits have done this throughout history as well. But anyway, that's just some interesting sort of things I took from what you said there. So thank you.
Thanks for, I hope you can hear me, but thanks for the, I'm going to speak without the microphone for the answer. We could go on and we should go on perhaps in another Zoom session next week for continuing on this kind of duality. I will stop myself here in the order of time. Maybe we open the Q&A to the audience and see if anyone wants to intervene, comment.
Do they have to come to the front?
Would be best.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, any questions from the audience? We'd invite you guys to maybe, or we translate. Oh, to them. Yeah, can also. Yeah, any questions from the audience? Oh, Jamie? Yeah, got one right there.
I just had out.
Wait.
Hi. So, everything's coming live and direct. Oh, bless you. It won't be double feedback.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You have
Sorry, this one needs to be off. Hello. Oh, no one coming right there. I don't know if you can see me or not, but thank you so much. Like the enthralling, genuinely. I'm going to take me a while to process much of what you said, and thank you so much for all of the enriching anecdotes that you shared for each of the stories there. I really enjoyed that, but I have to ask the question, because you offered it up. What did ChatGPT say?
yes.
That's the one, right? You left it hanging.
It actually was the very first content on moods. It said the one thing that we're not able to trace, and it said this is a unique insight that we haven't thought about, is that we're not able to follow moods. The problem is neither are we humans. So we're both sort of in the fog of the unknown there. But if we could somehow work moods, and I could give examples, my greatest example of this is always Kafka. I think Kafka is the absolute master of moods. That's what the Kafkaesque is. It's a certain temperament, a certain temperature, a certain climate. You walk into a room and you say, it feels Kafkaesque in here. You know how damned good you have to be as a writer to have a type of air named after you. I always say that. It's the greatest honor. So I think that we would have to start thinking about how to orchestrate moods and atmospheres in that way. You know, there's another place we might look. Your question, thank you for your kind comments. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm also interested, and this is actually a chapter of the second volume as well. You're the only ones to know this, in literatures about found bodies. So actually, if in Latin American literature, this has become increasingly prevalent here and there. Gabriel Garcia Marquez had two stories, one called, it's only 3 pages long, The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World, and which is about a giant who washes up on the shore of this coastal village, and these children find his body, and he's a dead giant. They take him in, they wash him, and all of that. They end up giving him a name, and that's, by the way, the end of things for him. Talking about night school and conspiracies. As soon as they say, oh, we should name him and we should make him a citizen, he becomes disenchanted, and they end up throwing the body back in the ocean as a result of that. But at the beginning, he's this complete foreign object, you know, and he's this air of mystery that washes up, and he reinvigorates and re-enlivens the whole town. You know, it's fallen into decay. Nobody puts flowers out anymore. But because of the arrival of this weird corpse, this found corpse, suddenly everyone feels compelled to recharge their universe. He also, Garcia Marquez also has another one called An Old Man with Enormously Large Wings, which is that there's this poor town, and all of a sudden in the backyard of this husband and wife, an angel falls into it. But it's ragged and deformed, and it's in pain, and they end up chaining it up and turning it into a spectacle sideshow where everybody in town pays them money and they get rich, showing off this this fallen angel. And then at the end, it flies away and nobody cares because it was just a trend anyway. But another book, just quickly, I would mention, if no one has read it, Fernanda Melchor, a great Mexican writer, contemporary Mexican writer, has a book called Hurricane Season, which begins with children finding the body of a witch in a swamp. And my point in making this up is that this gimmick, this move, this technique of the found body is about starting your book off as a mood, because it's a big question mark. You don't know what the body is. You can't identify it. It's a complete stranger. And so it brings us into the moods of estrangement. So I may be onto something there, or ChatGPT was just being kind to me and merciful and saying that I had actually come up with something because it feels bad for me.
Thanks.
Other questions from the audience, maybe? Okay, well, what do you guys think? I can ask a question. Hi, Jason. Okay, I'll also speak into the mic. I guess. Check,
I
check.
hear you perfectly.
Okay. Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, I thought really like it was fascinating and compelling set of strategies that you proposed. Maybe a bit pessimistic or even cynical, but I'd say that given the state of technology today and the general direction that the world is going in, maybe realistic. But yeah, I can't help but feel like there's some kind of affinity between your project and this idea of a coming new dark age, right? Like, and I guess the idea would sort of go like, you know, now we are maybe in the last days of the age of transparency, where you know the internet is still kind of beholden to this Western and kind of liberal ideal of like you know, total communication, connecting people, or like a treasure trove of knowledge, etc. Right? Whereas like the kind of direction we're going down is pointing us to you know, an age of misinformation, a time when like there's just so much slop and so much hallucinated content, it becomes impossible to like tell what's true and to differentiate between what's true and what isn't. And it seems like, in some respects, the strategies that you've outlined are kind of maybe appropriating some of the trappings of that new dark age, right? Where there's, you know, for example, kind of couching knowledge in like layers of subterfuge as a kind of encryption, right? Controlled hallucinations, even as a way to like kind of throw people off the scent. So I don't know. I'm just kind of broadly wondering, I guess, how you're kind of seeing this. Is this night school kind of a proposal to accelerate into the new dark ages? Is it kind of a way to survive these last days of transparency, or like, I mean, how are you kind of mapping these strategies onto this general kind of historical trend?
It's a great question. The technologies, all technologies, this is the history of technology itself, are always double-edged swords. They have utopian potentialities, they have dystopian consequences, and they have a third category, which is the one I'm most interested, which is the strange or unforeseen possibilities that they have. That's our job as creative or visionary sort of types. We may lose sort of in the short rounds of history, but they can't get rid of us. We keep coming back. We artists and thinkers and philosophers, and all of that throughout history. We recur in spite of all the authoritarian, the inquisitions, the prison camps, that we come back time and time again. If there is a dark touch to what I'm talking about, or a doomsday element, just to contextualize, and I really appreciate your comment. I am Iranian, and the past 2 months for me have been exhausted and consumed by looking at images of dead bodies, body bags, calling my cousins and my uncles and my aunts in Iran to see if they're still alive every day. Every single day I wake up, and my first duty is not to go and write, but it's to go see if they're still alive. And these back-to-back merciless events of an almost genocidal self-killing of a regime of its own people, then followed by an imperialist war. And so this is a horror show, sort of, in consecutive forms. And what I would tell all of you that, and I have to read letters every day from friends of mine who are like yourselves. They're great artists and they're great ingenious thinkers and all of that. And they're contemplating suicide. They have survivor's guilt. They've seen their friends shot, in the past days. We have to remind ourselves, for all the beauty of this Biennale, the sheer amount of violence that has to happen in the world just for us to stage this conversation. And in the most ancient territories of civilization, this should be a cautionary note. Everyone treats the Middle East, where I come from, as if it's some far away, remote location. It is the origin of human civilization. And it's on fire. It's burning right now. And so the interesting question is, I spend a lot of time these days listening rather than talking, which is to say, I'm learning from them. I'm watching how they move in these spaces. And there's no shortage of inspiration for this talk. If this seems, a lot of it seems abstract, believe it or not, it's because they are moving towards abstraction. The last genre that people in a war zone want is social realism. Not because they're trying to escape or transcend the violence, but because it's condescending to tell some Iranian grandmother right now, who's just lost 3 of her grandchildren, to write some poem about people being shot. She knows that. She's living that. She wants delirium. She wants imagination. She wants some otherworldly inflection. Her poets have to rise to the occasion and speak outside of the realm of the real. And that's not hiding, and it's not escapism, and it's not narcotization. It's none of those things. It's a movement. It's an attempt to move against and beyond the systems of the real. Because if we lose that, if there is nothing, then we are in pure totalitarianism, and it's game over. And then those friends of mine in Iran have to honestly wonder whether they should go on one more night. So they have to believe there's still something that hasn't been said, still a game that hasn't been played, which is why I'm trying desperately through this type of work to try and ignite abstraction in a very lived, vital way, though, in a very electrifying way, but moving more towards abstraction rather than towards reality principles, which are killing us again.
Other questions from the audience, maybe, or thoughts, comments, anything. Okay, going once, going. Oh, there we go. Nice.
Okay. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. Hello.
Gonna sit on it as well. Can you hear me
Can
now?
you hear me?
Yes, I do. Nice to meet you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe drop. No, my goodness. Okay, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. I often found myself getting
It's a wonderful question because I actually started noticing recently in places like Iran that there was a sudden spike in folklores of horror, like sort of old localized provincial horror stories about weird figures who come out of swamps, smoke creatures who will come in the night and steal children. You know, all these kinds of old tales are coming back, and I've always liked them. To be honest with you, I'm on the side of superstition as a countermeasure, not as a form of belief. I don't necessarily believe in superstitions, but I do believe in self-fulfilling prophecies. I do believe that if uh, heck, it even worked for emperors, crazed emperors like Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and Napoleon, who I'm not great fans of, but they all believed they were immortal and they survived. But they're three of the only figures in history who would always fight at the front lines. They should have died statistically like 1,000 times, but their delusion of invincibility actually upped their probability of survival. And so here's what I was going to say to this is that I've always loved these superstitious folklores about creatures that come out of weird territories, the forest, the jungle, the mountain, the desert, the cave, the underworld, because one, they usually are the property and the domain of the most marginalized members of society. In our villages, it's old women who carry these legacies forward. Now, these old women are excluded from the dominant economy, political arena, religious hierarchies, military. So they have no access to power channels. So they carve out their own alternative form of agency and power by having these rituals and ceremonies and healings and cursings and sort of all that allow them to feel that they have influence over reality. They also live often off of that, like they sustain their very ability to eat off of that. But then I wondered, why is this young generation, for instance, Iran is 70% of the population is under the age of 40. It's an extremely young population. Why are they revisiting these old grandmothers' tales of creatures? And I realized something. If you're living in a totalitarian society and your hands cannot reach the supreme leaders, you start to fantasize about typologies of creatures who could overthrow them, right? And who have sources of power that are not internal to the system, that belong to some other outside sort of, sort of source. And I even noticed this really interesting that you guys are in Singapore right now. And so Singapore is one of the most futuristic societies on earth. So when you're talking about this, I go to Dubai often. I've gone to Dubai. I mean, I lived in Dubai when I was much younger as a child, and I saw it being built and all of that. And Saudi Arabia is trying to join this race for futuristic megacities right now, as many people know. And it's trying to take its own paradigm, smart cities, automated cities. And at the same time that it's building like these huge $1 trillion linear cities in the middle of the desert. It has also formed 9 police units dedicated to arresting witchcraft, arresting sorcerers. You guys can Google this. There's this huge, now you might say, why in this sudden propulsion towards modernization and futurism, do you have this weird return to policing occultism, right? It's not medieval. It's because people are turning to it, right? There's actually this huge sudden wave of interest among young people in the occult again, right? And it's, again, because of the authoritarian pyramidal power structure that they feel is too domineering and too oppressive. And so they're looking for weird alternative channels to go through. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unbelievable space for art, as well as what I mean, I don't want to say, I have a much younger brother and sister who sometimes say, you know, in your day, and I'm like, I'm still alive. I'm not, you know, I'm not gone, but I guess it's not my day anymore. But I will say this young generation, I think I'm part of it technically, but this generation, contemporary generation, has completely redefined horror as well. You know, and we could get into that in horror cinema, right? When I was a little kid in the 80s, my father, you know, would introduce me to films I should not have seen. But there was always some fiend or monster that you were either supposed to kill or outrun. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween. You either had to kill this evil force. And now we're in this sort of transcendent, and I think this was the word cosmic horror, where the whole universe is evil. You see this in Midsummer, you see this in The Lighthouse, you see this in, you know, in Us, you know, by Jordan Peele. You know, you see this where just, and there's this, The Witch, you know, you see this where just everything, the stones are evil. The sky is evil, the trees are evil. And at the end, all you can do is surrender to kind of an immersive experience of that evil. That's why they all end with this ecstatic smile, this weird smile on their face, because they've just given into it. What that says, I didn't make that up. That's your generation that's doing this. It's a cool move. I'm not sure what the full implications are, but I like it.
Do we have any final questions? No, if not, let's thank Jason.
Thanks everyone for, no, I prefer with a microphone. For sticking with that. I think all presentations sort of address the question of constructing alternative or pluralizing the model of the world, which pretty much was also how we began scripting the manifesto of primal instinct, which was like the idea of you need to build something and you need to kind of extract or reduce yourself to something else or to nothing in order for you to kind of create this new sort of like state of extension, which are kind of in a way what we call models that are made of language, that are made of symbols, that are made of signs and word, and maybe new languages need to be invented for that. So I think it was super enriching for all of us as a research experience for ourselves to be exposed to that plurality. I think it's non-exhaustive as a type of research. It's a very premise of such research to be open, so we'll look forward to the new stages of this that will be maybe taken on with Hothouse or new collaboration or new collaborators. So yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, Jason, we have drinks and a pizza here, and Kini as well. You cannot join us next time you're in Singapore. Jason, you're muted, but the sound is up. We cannot hear you. Sorry.
It's fine. Have a wonderful night, everyone. It's been great talking.
Thank you. Bye bye. Good night.